I just want to start by thanking the Luohan Academy for inviting me to be here. It's been thrilling to listen to all the rest of the speakers and discussants so far. And so thanks to everyone for the really interesting insights. And I'm looking forward to more conversation that we can have on this. I can't remember who said it before, but someone said, when they got this invitation, maybe it was Professor Lowe, thought, oh, I'm not really a diversity scientist. And I have to admit, I had a little bit of the same response, my own self, but started thinking about, what is it that I could offer to this conversation? So with that in mind, I'm gonna take a fairly high level approach and focus in on some of the ecological and social ecological systems side. And to that end, I'll just start making sure we're all on the same page about that from a biological sense. And diversity has been a really hot topic, a center of ecological attention for really almost 50 years, from first being explored by Thomas Lovejoy in 1980, where we were talking about biological diversity, then a shortened form starting maybe in the late 80s. And so far today, we've really talked about the role primarily of diversity in social systems and in financial systems and organizations. So I want to just touch a little bit on the ecological point of view that we might take about diversity. And in ecology, if I just summarize that, it's really just a way of thinking about the variety of life at multiple scales and in multiple ways. So I'll start with just a little bit of background, make sure we're all using terms in the same way and on the same page so that you can get a sense of where I'm coming from. So when we talk about diversity in ecology, that includes, all the animals, all the plants, the insects, the microorganisms, and that really is species diversity. And that's maybe the first thing that comes to mind when you hear an ecologist say diversity. And it's important to point out that's not just the species that we see or know about, but ones that we don't as well. It also includes, though, where these species live and how they connect and how they interact. And that's what we might call ecosystem diversity. And it includes the genetic makeup of each living being that we might call genetic diversity. And to me, it's really important to start there, because I think in ecology, we say biodiversity, and we're using that often as a shorthand for species diversity. But the reality is much bigger, and that these other forms of diversity at other scales are really important and have a really important impact on the resilience of ecosystems and social ecological systems and landscapes, because they're influencing the potential and the actual responses to a bunch of different stressors that we might put on those systems. So if we look at why for a minute, and hone in, for example, on genetic diversity, the inter-individual diversity of genes, and that's going to affect the adaptive potential of a species in the face of environmental change. So diversity, in this sense, helps to maintain the viability of populations. It increases the survival potential of a species, essentially by providing different potentials, different opportunities that could be taken advantage of and carried forward through natural selection. So species diversity gives us the number of species in a given area, influences the potential and resilience of an ecosystem. If I scale that up a little bit, ecosystem diversity is about the ecological interactions of ecosystems, and it's going to influence the resilience of landscapes. So why it works that way, if we think about species diversity, each species, so that's one of these little bumps here, has some sort of ecological function of some intensity and some amount. And those functions together provide for our ecosystem some sort of stability in the face of different stressors. And redundancy, which is kind of the overlap in those little bumps, means that we can retain a function even if we might lose one of the species. So what diversity does in that sense is provide a number of different elements that influence ecosystem function. So I think about that as being it's the diversity of information that the system needs. So if we dig into that a little bit more and ask ourselves, well, why is that important? We can think about the role that these different components play in providing different options. And that's an idea that's come up in several talks before, this idea of diversity as a series of options. And so systems in this case with different components, different species, maybe different actors, different sources of knowledge, are generally more resilient than systems with few components. And redundancy is providing a kind of insurance with that system, allowing some components to compensate for loss or failure of others. And that redundancy can be even more valuable if the components providing redundancy are reacting differently to different changes and disturbances. So that gives us what ecologists might call response diversity. And that's a sort of functional redundancy. It's components that are performing the same function, providing insurance within the system, allowing components to compensate for the failure of others. And so if we think of a few examples here, for example, if you have one crop in a farm system that's sensitive to floods and another crop that's sensitive to droughts, and you're growing both of those crops, your overall farm might be a little bit more resilient in the case of either a flood or a drought, because you've got something else to fall back on. We get that also in social systems, and this has come up in some of the other talks where people of different backgrounds, that might be genders or cultures or whatever, have different ways of interacting. In the case of ecological systems, they might be using a resource differently, providing less stress ultimately on the resource. So I talked about this example of farmers planting different kinds of crops. Another example might be in parts of Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania and the Seychelles. Coastal fishermen are more likely to leave fishing in response to declining catches if they have households with more diverse livelihood portfolios. So in that case, that livelihood flexibility is increasing the resilience of individual households, but it looks like it also reduces the pressure on different parts of the system by allowing resource users to move away from using a particular resource when it's under pressure. So even though in both of those cases, the income of the farmer or the fisherman might be maximized by specializing in a single activity, by having a portfolio of options in this study, those households become more resilient, and often those systems, ecosystems, or landscapes become more resilient as well. Okay. So all together, then, diversity in biological systems helps to confer some kind of resilience on the system, where I'm thinking about resilience as the amount of disturbance that system can absorb and remain largely in the same state, or providing the same function, is how we might measure that. And that depends in part on the ecosystem's ability to adapt and reorganize and to learn in response to disturbance. And this is where response diversity, these different responses to a crisis or stressor, are really important. So in this case, we might think of the dynamics of a system, its potential states, as being expressed by this shape of the curve and the state at any one time being expressed by this red ball that is pulled into or falls into various depressions in that surface. And the depth of the pit helps us to see or visualize how stable the system is in that configuration. In other words, how hard or easy it is to get the ball in and out of that state. So in this case, it's quite easy, quite low resilience to move this ball out of this flat grassland state, quite hard to move out of the dust bowl state once you happen to be in it. And so that happens to be an example where we think of the resilient state as being maybe a negative or bad thing in this dust bowl, but there's also examples where we might think about the resilient state as being the more desirable. And I think the important thing here is that different landscape topographies might exist at different levels of species richness. So the light line, let me go to the next, grab this. So when we have different levels of species richness, we get different shapes of these curves. So this light line with low species richness gives us a relatively flat cup there, relatively low resistance. And as we increase in species richness or in other forms of diversity, what we're doing essentially is deepening that cup and providing a more resilient landscape for ourselves. So ultimately, what that means, and this is, again, has come up in several other talks so far, is that biodiversity is going to be especially important in terms of in times where we're facing a lot of change. And so ultimately, what does that mean? So one thing it means is that we need to be thinking about diversity in the sense of redundancy. I think in social ecological systems and governance, we often find ourselves striving for maximizing efficiency, which is sometimes at odds with redundancy. And so maybe we need to be thinking about diversity at a variety of different levels as a more explicit focus of conservation. Then let's talk about ecological diversity, which we were just talking about. And the key, I think, here for me as an ecologist is to not forget that this isn't just about species, but is also about ecological diversity at the ecosystem, at the landscape, and at the genetic level. And importantly, that we need to think about this as both a reservoir of redundancy and of a reservoir of response diversity. That then brings up the point for me of building diversity into governance, which can include diversity of knowledge, of practices, of ways of using and approaching ecosystems. And then finally, just this focus on efficiency, which often undermines diversity because it's more efficient to streamline, right? That's the cost. And so when we think about that farm that I mentioned before, it's certainly more efficient for the farmer to have one type of crop, only one machine that they need to harvest, only one set of information and knowledge that they need to have about seasonality and weather patterns, et cetera. That might be more efficient, but is certainly not as resilient or as diverse. So let me move just for a minute about why this matters at a planetary scale and how it plays out in different arenas other than species diversity. And what I want to focus on there is that we're, as a planet, facing a lot of critical challenges here represented by these planetary boundaries, which outline 9 global systems for which there's reason to believe that there are important global thresholds with potential for significant impact on people if we cross those thresholds. And we're facing not only a lot of challenges, but a lot of planetary change. And as has been mentioned, just like this farmer responding to potential drought or floods, we find ourselves in a situation where as a society, we need diversity to respond to these challenges, to respond to this changing environment. So luckily, as we look around, we see people responding to these challenges with lots of different ideas about how to address these challenges, how to face the future. And that is in itself a kind of diversity, this diversity of ideas about what might help us to bring about a better future. And you can probably think of a lot of examples yourself. I was just reading in the newspaper yesterday about a group of older people in poor neighborhoods in Philadelphia who walk together a few times a week. It started as a way to maintain their physical health, but in doing that, they're maintaining the health of their community because they're connecting to one another. They have talked to one another about problems that they're facing in their community, maybe empty lots that they want to restore and do something with. So, people are amazingly creative at solving problems. And a group that I'm working with is trying to collect these different ideas and learn from them. And we call them seeds, or seeds of good Anthropocenes. We currently have about 1,000 of different examples of these, and we're trying to focus in now on particular systems, mostly food systems, and especially food system transformation in some major African cities, to try to understand how this diversity of ideas influences the resilience of systems and the way that we go about solutions. So just as with biological diversity, there's both a cost and a value of this diversity of solutions. So of course, every solution has a cost, and more solutions generally means more cost. Also, solutions don't always work neatly together. They can collaborate, but they can also compete or conflict, and that has a cost. And of course, multiple solutions might be less efficient than focusing on just one solution that works well. But there's also a value in these diversity of solutions. And, as we heard, I think at the very outset with Simon Levin telling us, long-lived systems are adaptable, and being adaptable requires having a lot of different solutions because no one solution is going to work every time or in every place. So when we have well-coordinated solutions, they can reinforce one another. When we maybe aren't thinking about coordination, many different solutions work like experiments from which we can learn. Those solutions aren't independent, of course. They can interact in a variety of ways. If we think about that just very simply, they can be reinforcing one another. So cities that are going green or climate neutral at the same time can share information or cooperate about ways that they're doing that. But they can be contradicting or counteracting. So that might happen where efforts to green grazing practices can be contradicted by efforts to reduce meat eating that influences the viability of those grazing operations. And we can think about that in a little bit more complex way, where we're not thinking about just the outcomes, but actually different pathways of interaction. So what's going here? So here, for example, we can see some solutions that simply aggregate. So where we get simply a sum of the outcome. The global food demand is the sum of demand from all regions, quite simply. But we can get other things as well, interactions, pathway interactions like leakage, where we have offsets from one region to another, where we see European bans on deforestation in the face of persistent demand for wood simply increases deforestation elsewhere. And we need to be thinking about that. On the more positive side, we can get interactions of learning, where action in one place actually enables action elsewhere. So in Germany, for example, we saw society learn from manufacturing solar cells that reduced the costs of future solar cells everywhere and made it easier for other countries to follow on this pathway to increased solar energy development. Or we see examples of contagion where action spreads. So the Greta Thunberg school strike that exploded into a global youth movement, or the Arab Spring. So all of these modes of pathway interaction increase the complexity of how we think about these variety of solutions. And so we might think about that then like this, where again, we have this ball that's the state of our planet that is traveling down some pathway, being routed into these deeper or more resilient, easy to get into depressions. But I would encourage us, rather than think about that as one global system, to think about that as many interacting regional systems where not only is a region going down a particular pathway, but the pathway that it's going down is either constraining opportunities in other regions or providing opportunities in other regions. And that all together, those pathways might add up in a variety of complex ways to some global outcome. Okay, so let me just pull this together here. So we've seen that we're in this period of global, very, very rapid change. The solutions that we need are also changing. Having a diversity of solutions results in more options, more creativity, and more creative solutions. But there are some things that we need to do to maximize the impact of that diversity. In biological systems, the combination of diversity and selection does this for us. But when thinking about solutions to global problems, we may need institutions to do this sort of coordination and anticipation and learning for ourselves. So I hope that as we continue on with our session here, that we might have some time to talk about how we can study and learn from a variety of solutions, what kinds of things what we need to think about to coordinate collection and sharing of that knowledge that we learn from studying these different solutions, how we can anticipate opportunities for collaboration and cooperation, and then how we work to maintain a diversity of solutions, including some that maybe aren't perfect or most efficient, so that we are giving ourselves that diversity of solutions that we might need in times of rapid change.